Basically what we're going to be discussing today are domestic politics as a source of instability in sub-Saharan Africa. And so I believe that you sort of talked more about traditional conflicts. My particular research interest and what I've been working on over the past couple of years is lower level violence. So not necessarily civil wars, but instead the kind of electoral violence and riots that we see in places like Kenya and Nigeria. And those are the two countries where I've been working most. What I sort of want to start out today doing is laying out two assumptions that often serve as base assumptions about the causes of insecurity in Africa. So these have an impact on how we study conflict in Africa, violence in Africa, and they also lead to some gaps and distortions in the way that we maybe pursue policies as well. So the first of these is the idea that ethnicity can serve as a master key to understanding African politics. So we'll start out talking about this myth that ethnic diversity or ethnic cleavages are what lead to violence in a number of countries. And then second is the issue of state weakness. Now at the end of the presentation I'm going to come back to state weakness because I think there has been a sort of sea change in the way that the policy community and the development community is looking at state weakness, and I think now we're dealing with a much more nuanced appreciation of how state weakness interacts with conflict. But in the past I think there was this base assumption that the reason that African societies or African countries are conflict prone is because of the particular qualities of the African state. Both state weakness and ethnicity, I want to argue, are actually much more common or much more complex phenomena than we usually see them as. So to start off, ethnicity is a source of conflict, and this may be things that y'all are already familiar with. The classic argument that's out there, and this is definitely prevalent within academia, but I also hear it in policy circles a lot, is this sort of classic boiling pot argument. And this is the idea that there are always, in these ethnically diverse societies, there are always these sort of simmering resentments that are just waiting to sort of be brought to the fore. So these cleavages are always salient between groups. And should there be some kind of shock to the system, should there be some kind of collapse of state authority, then these already extant animosities just sort of bubble over. And this leads to conflict and violence. The classic example is Yugoslavia. This is usually the way in which people talked about Yugoslavia, both academics at the time of the Yugoslav conflict, but also, New York Times, policy circles, even US decision makers. And in Africa, this kind of argument I think is even more common because there is this assumption that ethnic animosities are magnified by the particular structure of African politics, in particular the primacy of clientelism or ethnic clientelism. So in other words, in African political systems, because power is so heavily centralized and because there has been this sort of winner-take-all mentality in many countries since independence, these already existing ethnic animosities turn to this zero-sum politics very, very quickly. Now, is there some evidence that it actually plays out this way? Yes, of course. We look at, across a broad swath of African countries, we can see differential regional development. So in countries where a single ethnic group has had the presidency since independence, or a small number of ethnic groups have had control of the executive since independence, we do see the regions that those ethnic groups are centered in to be more developed, to have lower rates of infant mortality, to have more roads, to have more factories. So we definitely see this differential regional development, which does suggest that there's a winner-take-all politics operational. And then post-1990, which is really when we begin to see the beginning of the turn to multi-party politics in Africa, we have seen in some countries very strong evidence of consistent patterns of ethnic voting. So ethnic voting does take place in some African countries, not everywhere, and I'm going to cast doubt about how well elections operate as an ethnic census, even in the places where we expect ethnicity to be most important. But there are some patterns of ethnic voting that we can see. And then in some civil wars and other conflicts, we definitely see ethnic grievances coming to the fore and this kind of sons of the soil rhetoric being employed. So if you think back to Côte d'Ivoire, which has obviously often been in the news over the past year, this sons of the soil, or this idea of certain ethnic groups being indigenous to Côte d'Ivoire and others being foreign, this is something that has been consistently manipulated in Côte d'Ivoire really since independence, but particularly during the Civil War era of the past 15 years. Similarly, the Second Congo War, the use of sort of this notion that Banyamulenge, or a Tutsi resident in eastern DRC, are non-indigenous and therefore don't have a right to the protection of the Congolese state, that's also something that very much plays on this notion of ethnic animosity and ethnic grievances being central to conflict. Now, what I want to suggest is, even though we do see some evidence of ethnicity really being central to some conflict situations in some places where there's low-level violence, relying on ethnicity as a sort of master key can lead to some really flawed assumptions. And first of all, it's important to underline that the centrality and the salience of ethnicity actually differs very widely across countries. And this is partly dependent on ethnic demography, or on the configuration of countries. And it's partly, I would say much more importantly, due to past strategies of rule. So if we look at these sort of paired countries that are similar in some respects, Kenya and Tanzania, they're not exactly similar in terms of ethnic demography, but they are fairly fragmented kind of ethnic systems. They're not systems in which there's a single dominant ethnicity. And yet we look at these countries, very, very different outcomes today in terms of the salience of ethnicity. And most economists, most sociologists, most anthropologists, most political scientists who work in these countries suggest that has a lot to do with post-independence strategies of rule. So in Kenya, ethnicity was used as a means of mobilizing support. It was sort of built into the state very, very systematically. In Tanzania, on the other hand, you had a sort of socialist-leaning government that really downplayed ethnicity. And that has lingering effects on how people are oriented to the state and how political competition is structured. Similarly, Rwanda and Zimbabwe, I mean, they're not similar countries, but they have similar ethnic demography. So in both, you have a dominant ethnicity, which is about 85% of the population, and then an ethnic minority that's 15%. Yet if we look at these two countries, very, very different outcomes. In Rwanda, obviously, ethnicity heavily central, leading to genocide in 1994. In Zimbabwe, on the other hand, despite, I think, attempts at various points to maybe use some ethnic appeals, really ethnicity hasn't been central to politics. And though violence has occurred very, very systematically over the past 10 years, it hasn't been structured around ethnicity as the primary cleavage. And then secondly, and I think this is actually a really exciting area of research that academics are just moving into. And this is the idea that the effectiveness of ethnicity appeals is variable and can actually swing very quickly. So some work that I think is really fantastic that's being done now, and it still hasn't been published, although his earlier work has, is there's a Beninois political scientist who's actually I think he just moved to Princeton. He was previously at NYU. And he's gone back to Benin and has done some work that first suggested that clientelism is the way that everyone is sort of oriented towards politics. So he ran these experimental studies in which he exposed some villages to a political campaign, and these were real-life campaigns. We see a bunch of old student activist friends. He had real-life campaigns that he ran, some villages. He had the political parties run purely clientelistic campaigns in which they said things like, our group has never gotten good stuff in the past and it's now our turn to eat. And then he had the political parties run in other sort of randomly selected villages political campaigns that said, all Beninois need to have access to education, and if elected, I'm going to make sure that this is consistently distributed across the country. In that research, he found clientelism always wins. So it seems to reinforce this notion that, if you're a politician in Africa, play ethnicity and you'll win every time. However, he went back and did a second study. And in this study, he basically ran the same experiment. However, prior to these villagers being exposed to political campaigns, he had a sort of one-day kind of teach-in where he brought NGO staff out to some villages and gave them, like, here's how water works, and this is how, the politics of economic reform in Benin. Here are some things that we've tried in the past. And so, they had all of these workshops teaching villagers actual policy expertise. And then he had this same experiment, and he found at that point that clientelism was no longer a significant predictor of people's voting patterns. So basically, if you teach people and if you sort of run this kind of programmatic campaign and give people a little technocratic expertise, they no longer rely on ethnicity as a shortcut to choosing how to vote. And I think that there's a lot of really exciting work that is just emerging in this field. And then finally, I think that this ethnic boiling pot theory has also often assumed that, once violence starts, there's no real way to get out of the cycle. So, if you are Tutsi and, your neighbor is Hutu in Rwanda, you've already got this history of genocide. That ethnic cleavage is already so incredibly ingrained by past experience that you're going to continue to think through the lens of ethnicity and think through the lens of past experience. And my own research in Nairobi slums suggests that this isn't actually necessarily the case. So I run survey-embedded experiments, which is a fancy way of saying I sort of manipulate language in surveys. And some research that I did in these slums, some of which had experienced very high levels of violence during the post-election violence in 2008, and some of which had experienced much lower levels of violence, is I sort of looked at, if people are confronted with one of their co-ethnics, are they willing to give that person a pass if they use violence? So if I tell you about a politician, and I say this guy hired some thugs during the last election, if he's your guy, presumably you're gonna say, well, my ethnic group, we were victimized, and so it's not good that he hires these thugs, but he's my guy. And we would expect that in very, very violent neighborhoods that had suffered ethnic cleansing, people would be more likely to give a pass to their co-ethnics. However, my research suggests the opposite, that actually in the neighborhoods that experienced the highest levels of violence, people were least likely. Well, actually, they just didn't rely on ethnicity. It was not a significant predictor of how they would sanction politicians. Instead, it was in the non-violent neighborhoods that you saw people relying on ethnicity and giving their co-ethnics a pass. So I think, this notion that conflict reinforces and hardens ethnic identities, it's not necessarily true. I don't really know what is going on in those Nairobi slums, but something else is going on in those Nairobi slums, which I'm still working on. Okay, so the second core assumption that we hear a lot. This is the idea that state weakness or the particular qualities of the African state are actually what's driving the fairly high incidence of violence on the continent. And again, the sort of classic account is out there, both in academia and also in the policy world. And this is the idea that, weak institutions, and we can blame whomever for the weak institutions. We can blame geography, we can blame disease, we can blame colonialism, whatever else. We know that African countries mostly came to independence with weak institutions. This led to a personalization of power, very poor state penetration of society. And so, we talk about, academics talk about the primacy of exit, how African societies or African citizens can sort of withdraw from the state realm, not pay taxes, not participate in the formal economy. This is a sort of poor penetration of society by state institutions. And then all of this leads to political instability because the state doesn't have the power to sort of order society and impose the rule of law. Again, the base narrative here is this idea of the politics of the belly, which is a very, very prevalent term in Africanist political science. And this is the idea that in African countries, in opposition to most other places on Earth, both Western Europe, but also when we talk about East Asia, or even Latin America to a lesser extent, In Africa, you have a real fusion of public and private realms. So a political office is not something that's given to a person in order to serve a purpose. Instead, it's treated as a personal possession once that person has control over that office. And so accumulation in public office, in other words, corruption or just sort of funneling of money into private coffers, then serves redistribution in the second realm. In other words, leaders steal from the sort of public good in order to redistribute to their own constituencies, be those ethnic constituencies, military constituencies, whatever else. And there is some evidence of this. I don't mean to say that there's no basis in fact for this characterization. African states do rely disproportionately on indirect means of revenue raising. So customs and excise taxes, obviously international development aid, and natural resources rents. So direct taxation in most countries is not a primary source of revenue. And that's because African countries, African states, for the most part, just do not have the capacity to raise taxes. They lack that penetration of society. They lack that ability to really sort of order both economic activity and also social activity within their territories. We can also see, the size of the informal sector, or the sort of, we might call it the black market. Although, given how large the informal sector is in sub-Saharan Africa, it seems strange to call it a black market. But the size of the informal sector is enormous. In some countries, up to 70% of economic activity occurs in the informal sector. In terms of community policing, or in terms of just basic security for citizens, in many African countries, that's a sort of self-help system. So there isn't a reliance on police or on state institutions to provide security or other basic state services. And in fact, if you look at the Afrobarometer data, which is the major public opinion instrument in sub-Saharan Africa, most people instead view the police and view state institutions as sort of bandits to be avoided, rather than people to turn to in times of trouble. And then obviously in some countries we have long-running insurgencies and civil wars, and in those countries, if we look at sort of, well, there just aren't functional state institutions in many of these countries that have been most commonly characterized by civil wars or by periodic recurring violence. So yes, state weakness is a partial driver of conflict, but as with ethnicity, I just want to suggest that the real story is a little bit more complex. So I think there has been this base assumption that state weakness in Africa is sort of hardwired. It's something that is really not amenable to change, and certainly not something that we can change fairly quickly with any kind of policy instruments. But I want to suggest that first of all, we do see state weakness as heavily variable across countries. Stronger state capacity is not necessarily associated with less conflict either. So state weakness may lead to conflict, but also state strength can lead to conflict. So again, Rwanda and Zimbabwe, because they're good examples for all kinds of things. These countries have two of the, they are probably the two strongest states in sub-Saharan Africa, or at least were prior to 1994 and 2000 respectively. These are countries in which, if you ask the citizenry prior to the genocide or prior to the land invasions of 2000, their attitude about the state, I've always been particularly struck by, in Zimbabwe, how people had these expectations of what the state is supposed to do. And they are genuinely outraged, in the way that Americans would be outraged at the lack of social services delivery. So they'll say things like, the state's going around killing everyone, and we don't really understand that, because states are meant to protect the citizenry and also provide basic services like free primary education and healthcare. And in other African countries, this is not a set of expectations that you run into. And this is very much a legacy of the strength of the Zimbabwean state and the way in which it functioned as a very strong state prior to 2000. Same kind of thing in Rwanda, where there was a very strong orientation towards the state prior to the genocide, and actually even in the present day, there is still a very strong cultural orientation towards the state. Secondly, if we're thinking about whether state weakness is hardwired, the tie between state weakness and the particular qualities of the African state is a little bit unclear. yes, we can say that there's this primacy of the politics of the Valley, but this is sort of confounded by a series of other developments that have occurred. So since the end of the Cold War, we have large-scale state rollback in all African countries, and this is a function of structural adjustment and the idea that the state should be small and lean, and that state spending in Africa was a source of many of, not just state spending, but also the centrality of the state in the economy was the reason for a lack of development in Africa. So this means that we have smaller states. We have fewer or less state monopoly on patronage resources. We have fewer services. We have bureaucratic decline. So we have all these things going on, which are more recent developments, aren't necessarily hardwired to the African state. And then this is also something that I've really been struck by in my own research. State capacity can tip very quickly the other way. And so the example that I find really eloquent and that I've been just blown away by is Lagos State in Nigeria. This is Lagos. You all probably have in your, if you haven't been to Nigeria, you probably have in your mind some image of what Lagos might be like. Men with machetes standing on overpasses and that sort of thing. It's not bad, but it was bad. It's better now. Basically what happened in the early 2000s is there was a dispute between the federal government and the Lagos state government over tiny bureaucratic matter involving subdivisions of local government areas. And Lagos state government refused to bend to the federal government, and the federal government said, well, fine, we're now going to just cut you off from oil revenue, and we'll see how long before you give in to what we're saying about LGAs. And Lagos state government said, well, fine, go ahead and do that. We don't need your oil money. We will just raise taxes. And for those of you who know anything about Nigeria, you can imagine the federal government laughed wildly at this and walked out the room. But what we've seen over the past 8 years under two different governors, but primarily under the current governor, is an amazing kind of change, both in the structure of government and also in state-society relations, only within Lagos State. So now, in terms of the state's budget, which is operating budget, which is very substantial. I mean, this is the largest center of economic activity in Nigeria. 70% of its revenue comes from taxation. And that's not just taxation of the rich. I work in slums, and I'm amazed at the percentage of slum dwellers who report that they pay taxes. And what's even more surprising is the percentage of both slum dwellers and other Lagosians who approve of paying taxes and say things along the lines of, well, if I get state services in return, I'm very happy to pay taxes to the government. And what the Lagos state government has actually done is in order to get these taxes, and in order to get these taxes year after year, they have expanded state services. So, traffic is better now because there are dedicated bus lanes. They cleared out some of the most violent and dirtiest market areas and constructed new market areas. They've expanded electricity and sewage in slum areas. They're doing slum upgrading projects all over the state in association with the World Bank. So, there has been this sort of change within less than a decade in the entire structure, I would argue. Well, I don't know if anyone else is doing research in Lagos now, but I would argue that there's been a real shift in the kind of state-society contract in Lagos. So, again, state weakness, not hardwired. Okay, perils of democratization. Okay, you guys probably know a lot of this. Since the end of the Cold War, we now have this sort of wave of democracy, which is going all over the world, and in Africa, as in many other developing countries, it's been less than perfect in terms of execution. So in most African countries, we may have multi-party elections. We're now going on 4 or even 5 rounds of multi-party elections. In many countries, some of those elections are even consistently free and fair. However, we still have very weak accountability in most of these countries. And this sort of low accountability or low intensity democracy interacts with ethnicity, and also interacts with low state capacity in conflict enhancing ways. So, Nigeria and Kenya, 2 of the countries that I know best, we obviously have bouts of fairly severe electoral violence with each election cycle. And, what I find disturbing is, there was an assumption, I think, that as we continued with democracy and as we continued holding elections, this violence or this instability that was associated with first and second round elections would gradually diminish. And instead, the countries that I work in, what I see is an institutionalization of the violence into the electoral process. So we now have militias that are organized by parties. These militia have an independent life outside of electoral periods, and there's no reason that we would not expect the next round of Kenyan elections, for instance, to be associated with fairly significant low-level violence. Nothing on the scale of, thousands of deaths, as in the post-election violence in 2008, but, significant low-level violence, beatings, threats, all of that sort of thing. I want to suggest that this kind of low-intensity, violent democracy, or this institutionalization of violence into elections, commonly this is talked about as, again, this kind of, it's all about ethnicity. Elections are an ethnic census, therefore they're very, very conflict prone. That's not what I see happening, or at least not in a simple way. So here you go, map of Nigeria. The green is CPC, which is none of them are ethnic parties because there's a structure to the Nigerian constitution that doesn't allow parties to pull entirely from one ethnic group. Instead, they have to get multi-ethnic support. So these are ethnic blocs, though. Those of you who are familiar with Nigeria probably know that it's a sort of three-way ethnic split. In the north, you have Hausa Fulani. In the southwest, you have Yoruba. In the southeast, you have Igbo. This is the most recent presidential elections. You can see the north is pretty solidly green, south is pretty solidly red, and then you have one state that is this smaller opposition party. These are the maps that we're generally confronted with. However, if we look at sort of sub-regional and constituency level data in Nigeria, the thing that gives me some hope is a lot of these constituencies within these regional blocks are actually competitive. So it's not as if, there are areas that are not. The southeast is very, very solidly PDP. And you'll get 80% of people in that area voting for PDP. But everywhere else, it is closer to maybe 60-40 or even less than that, even more competitive than that. And so that suggests to me that, parties are not particularly good at disciplining ethnic blocs, if that's what they're actually relying on. So, I just wanted to caution this sort of use of these kinds of maps at the presidential election level to suggest that elections are ethnic censuses. Also, we only see clean maps like this at the presidential level. If I showed you a parliamentary map, it would be all over the place. Kenya presidential election 2007, if you read the New York Times coverage of this, it was all about the election being an ethnic census. It was all about Kenya being, this heavily ethnicized place. And yes, if you look at the presidential map, again, it looks very, simple. It looks very, blue and green and red. But here we go. These are the presidential election results by region. And if I took you down to the constituency level, you would see, once again, even more competitive places than you would expect. So, here, let's see if I've got a little. The places where you see actual ability to discipline ethnic blocs are Central Province. This is a Kikuyu province, almost entirely. And yes, 97% of the people in Central Province voted for Kibaki, who is Kikuyu. The other place where you see fairly good ethnic discipline is Nyanza. 82.4% vote for Raila Odinga, who's Luo. This is a Luo province. Everywhere else, though, no party is able to really sort of, discipline the constituencies very well. These were multi-ethnic kind of coalitions that these two leaders cobbled together. But, even when they cobbled these alliances together, their allies couldn't deliver ethnic constituencies cleanly. If I took you down to the parliamentary level, which I find really fascinating, what we see in Kenya is a huge fragmentation in parliamentary voting at the constituency level over election rounds. So, it may have been back in 1992, 97, maybe even 2002, that people were thinking in terms of ethnicity because, they wanted to get the ruling party out, or they wanted to get their guys in. But instead, over the last 2 election cycles, and I would say even 3, politics has gotten much more complicated. So, within a single constituency, which is largely mono-ethnic, you'll have 12 people contesting to be member of parliament. And those people, the majority of them will be the same ethnicity. And the votes just fragment. So you have effective number of parties in some constituencies in Kenya of 8, 9, 12. This is a measure of fragmentation that political scientists use in the kind of in the kind of single-member district, first-past-the-post systems like we have in the United States. You never see effective numbers of parties above 2. It's one of the sort of empirical laws that we have in political science. If you think of the United States, we're pretty much a 2-party system, stably over time. In Kenya, on the other hand, incredible fragmentation. The national effective number of parties is now over 4 for the last election round. So obviously, if it were an ethnic census, people would figure out how to sort of, make this a stable 2-party system, which is not what's occurring. Okay, so it's not about ethnicity. I don't know if I've convinced you on that, but believe me, it's not about ethnicity. Electoral competition, as I just sort of suggested, it's fueled elite fragmentation and increasing predatory use of patronage and ethnic manipulation. So yes, politicians are, because there are 12 of them running in a constituency now, and they don't know what else to do except throw money at the issue or try to whip up some xenophobic kinds of sentiments. There is, I think, this race to the bottom in terms of electoral strategy. And also, we do see some state-sponsored violence associated with elections, so obviously Zimbabwe leaves out here. That is rare. Instead, what I find much more common is party and elite-linked militias being recruited and used during election cycles. And we see that across a wide swath of African countries. It doesn't usually pop up in the New York Times, because very rarely is the New York Times going to feature something about how a candidate's motorcade was driven off the road and his car was stoned, or how 2 groups of party activists beat each other with sticks and 4 of them ended up in the hospital. This is the sort of stuff that you see in local papers, particularly local papers in the vernacular, but you won't see it in international news wires. So I think it often escapes our attention. But that is very, very common in African elections at this stage, as it was incidentally in American elections in the 19th century. So, we should keep in mind that we have a history of election-linked violence as well. Okay, so, and I am running behind. High-functioning democracy is unlikely to emerge where weak rule of law and where elites are not seen as obeying the Constitution. This is, I think, particularly problematic. The kind of democracy that we see emerging in sub-Saharan Africa is particularly problematic because of its impact on popular faith in democratic institutions. And this is something that I think American policymakers should be really concerned about. We're watching, obviously, support for America and Middle East public opinion, support for democracy and Middle East public opinion. I think because Africa has generally been seen as very pro-Western and pro-American, we're maybe not as concerned about the erosion of faith in democratic institutions in Africa. But I think particularly in our sort of middle belt countries, or countries along the Sahel and in West Africa that have significant Muslim populations, we should maybe become more concerned about democratic institutions in the same way that I think we're trying to be more concerned about democratic institutions in the Middle East. Okay, problem of internal order. I've sort of talked about elections and violence. I've talked about how there's this use of specialists in violence, party-linked militia. There is insecurity even in interelectoral periods. The reasons for this is these guys, once you recruit them and turn them into thugs during elections, it's not like they forget their skills, and they do suddenly realize, hey, if we've got this group of thugs and we can force people to vote, then we could probably force people to pay us protection money as well. So one of the most feared criminal gangs in East Africa is an ethnic militia called Makiki, which the Kenyan state is now fighting pretty much an open war in Nairobi slums with. And Makiki started off as an ethnic militia used by opposition and then by the ruling party to to do work during election periods. It then decided, hey, why don't we migrate into cities and set up some criminal enterprises? And it now controls most of the commuter minibuses in Nairobi, and also a bunch of other rackets. And they're fond of killing people in very dramatic ways. The state is also it's not well instituted from external shocks. So this obviously also plays into the problem of internal order. This is partly due to economic reform, which has left states with very few sort of, slush funds with which to deal with external shocks. So they can no longer, when faced with a sort of, series of protests or riots in one area of the country, they can no longer sort of throw money at that issue in order to restore stability. And then secondly, the issue of food prices. And food prices are something that I'm not going to talk about. I'm sort of obsessed with them. So if you do have questions about food prices, I would love to talk about that in question and answer period. There are various reasons. The Economist occasionally runs articles on this. There are very reasons that we're dealing with some real structural changes in the global food market. And this is going to have knock-on effects throughout the world, particularly in lower income places where people spend a larger proportion of their income on just basic grains. We've also got in Africa youth and demographic bulges. This is exacerbated by the end of state employment because of structural adjustment, as I already mentioned. The lack of economic opportunity has knock-on social effects. Put most simply, if you've got a lot of young men between the ages of 18 and 25 lying around and they have neither jobs nor gaming systems, it is a sort of recipe for instability in these countries. Erosion. Whenever I talk about this in my undergraduate classes, my undergrads always say, oh, well, we're not going out and joining rebellions. And I'm like, yeah, you guys have like computer games. So you can pretend to join armies and kill people. It's very good sublimation. In any case, erosion of state reach and weak rule of law intensifies neighborhood effects, local resource grievances, et cetera, et cetera. So, if you guys have read, if any of you have read Paul Collier's The Bottom Billion, he talks about the conflict trap of bad neighborhoods. Well, you can imagine, even if you're a good country in a bad neighborhood, you're dealing with all of these transnational kinds of, guys coming across your border on cattle raids, and in the past they maybe had bows and arrows, now they have AK-47s because they're coming from Somalia. These kinds of neighborhood effects obviously exacerbate whatever internal state weakness and internal order problems you have. So we can talk about a series of countries that have really had they're not bad countries. Well, Chad is not great, but Northern Kenya, Kenya is a fairly well-functioning state, and yet Northern Kenya is not doing too great. Northern Ghana, which, Ghana is our blue-eyed boy, is very much done great with elections, more than 2 turnovers in power, very well with economic reform. It's having horrible problems over land disputes in Northern Ghana, exacerbated by neighborhood effects. Senegal, same thing, local level land disputes, exacerbated both by neighborhood effects and also by a long-running insurgency in Casamance. Northern Mali and Niger, the news of the week about this Libyan convoy moving through Niger, I think just underlines this, like poor Niger. And poor Nigerians who ended up in Libya and were accused of being mercenaries. So, basically if you've got a sort of tenuous grasp on rule of law and you're in a bad neighborhood, your life can turn pretty bad pretty quickly. Okay, so, wow. So really quickly, intervening in cycles of violence. And this is all new, and so it is going to be a little bit longer presentation than I've given in the past. I think that right now, in terms of what we're doing in the policy and the development community, there is a greater attention to a lot of what I'm saying. Not that people are responding to me in any way. Just these issues of state capacity, I think, are things that we're thinking about much more critically than we have in the past. And I think this starts with a greater attention to indirect and longer-term effects of violence. And so, I would really urge all of you to take a look at a report just released by the World Bank, which I've been looking at on Carolyn's suggestion over the past couple of weeks, which I really think is excellent. And it relies on a great deal of in-house research, which I've been following at the World Bank, which is really excellent quality research, both on the causes of civil war, but also they do a lot of really great work on low-level violence and on urbanization and the effect of urbanization on criminal activity and that sort of thing. And so World Bank has an incredible research base that they're drawing from, and this report really reflects that research base, I think. So what they show is that even low-level violence, we tend to think of civil wars as having this horrible effect on development and all kinds of social indicators, but even low-level violence that does not rise to the level of civil war, has a long-term effect on development. And then we also have this puzzle of why we have some post-conflict settings that are real success stories. So, yeah, I don't know why they're calling Ethiopia a success story. I wouldn't call Ethiopia a success story, but it is in some respects. It's a good economic performer. It's got some internal order issues, but they call it a success, and they see that as puzzling. Mozambique is very definitely a success. So, this was a long-standing civil war, and, we see Mozambique since the resolution of the civil war, and it has been really great. So, we have some post-conflict settings in which we do see real success and recovery, and then we have some places that aren't even necessarily post-conflict settings that have persistent problems of just sort of long-term, institutionalized, low-level violence, high rates of criminal activity. Guatemala and a lot of the Central American states, I think, are things to watch for this. Kenya, Jamaica. Jamaica has about 40 to 50 years of multi-party democracy, but a multi-party democracy that's very much organized around very violent elections and party-linked militia. So this is just a graph that I found very evocative. This sort of proves that point of even low-level violence has an effect on development. So the line in red is, this is the percentage of population living on less than $1.25 a day. The red is obviously your civil war countries. You would expect in civil war countries. We have seen an increase in civil wars since 1981, particularly in Africa. So, there is an increase in poverty in those places. But the blue line is our low-level violence. These are places that didn't turn into hot wars, but have the sort of problems with high rates of criminal activity or with party or state-linked violence. And even in those countries, you can see there's a massive gap between those and countries characterized or not characterized by violence in terms of reduction in poverty. So, we're reducing poverty across the board, but there are large gaps between countries on the basis of levels of violence in these places. This report that I mentioned, the World Bank report, does also suggest an about-face from World Bank policy of earlier decades on the role and character of the state. So, World Bank, like most development agencies in the 80s and 90s, was very much a fan of rolling back the size of the state and instead, letting markets bloom and, funneling money to domestic civil society and NGOs. Instead, this report, the focus now, they suggest, is on strengthening institutions in order to provide citizen security, justice, and jobs. This is old school emphasis on the state. This is not the kind of emphasis on the state that we've seen in for several decades now. This is sort of going back to this very Weberian notion of what the state should be providing. That, it should be a force that dominates society and sort of has the capacity to order society and provide basic security. And yes, how is it going to do that? It's going to do that through militaries and through police. And I think that there's been a great deal of nervousness since the 80s about talking about that function of states. And maybe I'm like a crypto conservative or something, but I find this very refreshing and a very good a very good emphasis to have. Okay, so very quickly, possible policy instruments. I can talk about this more in Q&A. The push for sort of speedy elections in particular is misplaced. We really should reconsider that, particularly in places with weak institutional capacity. There's also a huge amount of enthusiasm in policy circles right now on power sharing agreements. So I would argue that this has sort of become our default policy instrument in places where we see conflict. Bring everyone to the table, give everyone some civil service jobs, keep everyone in this sort of grand coalition. And I think that there are implications for institutional capacity and also state legitimacy that we really haven't examined with regard to power sharing agreements. Also, in my opinion, at least looking, well, no, I wouldn't just say Africa. I think in a lot of the other cases of power sharing elsewhere in the world, track record on these agreements has been really poor. It sets up some perverse incentives where suddenly every single guy with a pickup truck and some guns basically demands a place at the table and some ministerial positions. So it sets up perverse incentives. But I think even where it sort of functions and it results in stable power sharing agreements, it usually results in higher levels of corruption, less accountability, less competitive elections, a bunch of stuff that we don't really want. And then the final recommendation that I think emerges most strongly out of this World Bank report is that U.S. interventions in support of security sector and police reform in Africa should be supplemented. We have had these programs, long-running programs across the continent, military and police cooperation. But I think that even heavier investment might be something to think about, and I would be curious as to your thoughts on that, because I know a lot of you are coming from that side of things. And then, this doesn't come directly out of the World Bank report because they don't really talk about development assistance. But I do wonder whether another implications of this is if we're serious about strengthening state institutions, and if we believe that state institutions should be providing jobs and providing security and providing justice, then rather than funneling development assistance through civil society, as we have been doing for 2 decades now, maybe now is really when we should think about funneling development assistance back through old school ministries. Rather than sort of establishing schools at the grassroots level, why not work with the Ministry of Education and give them control over their own budgets, with some oversight on how those budgets are spent. So, I do think that right now we are sort of at a changing moment, particularly in attitudes about how to reduce conflict in Africa and the role of the African state in reducing those conflicts.